It is time for science to rule once again in psychological classrooms, offices, and journals, and not spirituality. It is time to toss away or leave to children the concept of let's pretend. Mankind's secular journey has just begun. Thank you for your patience and attention tonight.
Is it time for questions?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. I have a few questions and then I have some comments to make. Early in the lecture you mentioned that there's a lot of value on the street for existential psychology.
Yeah.
Could you give me some evidence to support that?
It's just when I was researching the books and I looked at the book reviews and I realized that there are gazillions, not gazillions, but very, very many reviews. And recently, in recent years, in the last 3-4 years, I mean, I looked at the dates,
Yeah.
and people are just, you know, thrilled by it. It's changed many people's lives.
They're still reading it.
They're still reading it.
Yeah.
So that's, I kind of mean on the street, you know.
Okay.
Because that's what existentialism too. People are buying
Yeah.
the books and talking about it. I was quite amazed. I had no idea anybody even knew about, you know, Maslow anymore or anything. That was, you know, my generation. And those topics were current at that time, and I was quite shocked. I was glad to see that also.
You use the word warfare to describe Freud's attitude about religion.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering why you feel or would say that he was acting in such a belligerence against religion. Obviously he criticized it, he critiqued it. It was one of several different cultural phenomena that he talked about. I think he talked much more, spends much more time on sexual repression and the suppression of the sex drive.
Which is caused somewhat by religion.
Somewhat by religion, but also there's cultural inhibitions. So I'm just wondering why you would describe what he wrote as warfare.
Well, David Wolfe, the author of the Psychology of Religion, or the editor really, but he also interpolates many of his opinions, considered it a warfare. And David Wolfe is a man who is not an advocate of religion. He's done a very fair book on the psychology of religion, much better than any sociology of religion volume that's been done. And might be the only good book to date on the psychology of religion.
David Wolfe?
Yeah, David Wolfe, W-U-L-F-F. You can find him in AtheistScholar.org in the psychology section.
Okay,
It's
good.
really excellent. It's a little dated by now.
So he says
He
that
considers
Freud
it. He considers it. Yeah, he considers that Freud, you know, waged war. Maybe that's too strong a word, but just think of how many books he wrote, and the one large paper. I mean, it seems to me that he was, and he banished the topic from his home.
I didn't know that.
Now, I didn't know that either. That's what I read. You know, I suspect it's correct. You know, and Peter Gay, who wrote a book about him, and who's a fairly good, I think, commentator on intellectual history in general. He's done a lot of intellectual histories. Peter Gay really feels he was very hostile to religion. Gay doesn't like religion either, so you know. I can't answer any more because I didn't, you know, I read a biography of Freud, the Jones biography, I think a long time ago, but it's, you know, not easily to recall what was going on in that. Don't you think he was pretty hostile?
Well, his goal was really to make a name for himself. I don't think he was an activist in the sense that Richard Dawkins is an activist against religion.
No.
By no means. I think that he had two audiences. One was the public, so he would write, you know, books like The Future of Illusion to sort of educate the public about psychoanalytic thinking. But also some of his other books were much more geared towards the working psychoanalysts, you know, that he was trying to educate and sway. It was much more narrow audience, and in those books, he doesn't really cover religion as a neurosis. It was more about the psychoanalytic process and the relationship with the patient. It wasn't about how do you convince your patients not to be religious.
Oh, okay.
That wasn't it. It was like, was much more drive theory about their drives and their conflicts about that.
But just think
So-
how he related the Oedipal complex, which is such an important part of his, you know, theory,
Yeah,
to, you know, to religion.
yeah, and but that writing came later than his first Oedipal theories
Yeah,
came later. So you might say that he was just using religion as an example of how that theory played out in the world. And then he would also use primitive peoples, which it was easy to give examples of their religion as flawed,
sure.
because it was looking, you know, back, and he compared the primitive peoples to the childhood. Our childhood, in essence, is a primitive culture that we then grow out of.
Hopefully.
That's what, yeah, that's what his point was with religion, that we would
That
grow
there
out of.
comes in, those statements there touched off thoughts in my direction too, is the myth of the past, myths of the past, which have been translated to the present, are explored and deconstructed to expose their commonality. Why are so many people clutching as strongly as their ancestors did to these same beliefs? What's going on? Why in the face of all the technology and exposure that the cultures have had, why are they clutching so hard?
Probably because it's starting to wane. And we have nothing to take its place so far.
And the EP people would say the brain hasn't been able
Right.
to evolve
Right,
in step with the technology,
that's right.
that our brains are still hunter-gatherers.
Yeah, but then I would come back and ask this question: how come, if this is the case, the little ones who are now, who have grown up with the technology, are so comfortable in that new era with
Yeah,
technology?
that's a very good question. That's a
What
very
has
good
happened to
question.
their brain? Why is their brain so much different than my brain?
It's
Mary's
cultural, it's cultural. See, I believe it's
Yeah.
cultural, I don't believe that it's evolutionary driven, I don't believe it's physically driven.
Yeah.
They used to, I was just telling Jim this morning that I remembered a phrase from college. They used to call, I don't know what they call it now, but they used to call this cultural lag. You know, when the technology, you know, advances so far and yet people, you know, still embrace rather outmoded, modes of thought.
Yeah.
And they used to call it cultural lag, and I see it as cultural, I don't see it as this genetic thing
No.
that the evolutionary psychologists embrace. I think that they're wrong.
Yeah.
I think there's probably some, you know, we've evolved from these early people, so there has to probably be some element, but not to the extent I think that they're, you know.
Yeah, and E.O. Wilson actually says pretty much the same thing, that the
Oh,
human
good for him.
brain of 40,000 years ago is pretty identical to the human brain of today, that it couldn't evolve in that short period of time, whereas cultures did evolve and societal structures did evolve.
Yeah.
And it's those things that have caused the differences that we see today between us and the man of 40,000 years ago.
But you know what, they're showing that evolution takes place quicker than they thought.
Yes.
So this is becoming a really contradiction.
Really gonna
Remember
be
I read this.
Shot around in academia is
About
really going to be
450, you know, years.
But you have to ask yourself what you're measuring when you say it's evolution is taking place. You have to decide what exactly are you measuring. Are you measuring, you know, intelligence, or are you measuring resistance to disease?
But what are they measuring?
If you're measuring resistance to disease, yes, in 40,000 years we have become more resistant to
Yeah.
disease.
Yeah,
If you look at lactose tolerance, yes, in that time, you know, people have gained or lost tolerance to
I think we're less
milk.
tolerant.
But when you talk about other things like this ability to believe or disbelieve, might be much slower in evolution. And that intelligence and creativity might also be much slower in evolving. The book Adapting Minds, can you give me the author of that again, please?
Sure, it's also in AtheistScholar.org.
Okay.
It's,
Bueller?
Yeah,
Bueller?
wait a minute, Yeah, it's Buller,
Could you spell that, please?
B-U-L-L-E-R.
Oh, okay.
David J. Buller, actually it's Buller, B-U-L-L-E-R. And it's called Adapting Minds, 2006. He does an excellent job. That Scientific American that we all have on evolution, that article alone
Yeah.
is, invaluable. I mean, he's showing that, the four great myths of the evolutionary psychology, and he's kind of exploded them, as well as the pansex. I think that it's, as I said, we've seen movements to come and go, and they're always that one theory that's going to explain everything. Freud thought he had it, Skinner thought he had it, but, I think that all these things can be considered and we can be interested in them, but I think to believe in them, to accept them as truth, I think that atheists doing that are becoming very faddish and jumping from one fad to the other. And I think it's a very poor idea. I think that if we claim to be skeptical, then we should be skeptical about, ideas that are, current in the society, and wait for more evidence to come in. I mean, I'm not denying the entire theory of evolutionary psychology. I think some of it must be correct. But, I'd like a lot more evidence. And what evidence do we have? They keep saying we have evidence of the Stone Age culture, the artifacts that were left behind. We can, I can remember, and I think that there's a point to what I'm saying, that scholars never used to stick their necks way out. Was that a mistake, or was it like good science? Historians at one time would not discuss Etruscan society very far because there wasn't enough writing. Any writing that they were able to decipher ultimately were business records, and they weren't very clear and everything like that. And I remember D.H. Lawrence, the novelist, wrote a very imaginative, history of the Etruscans, and it was fun to read. But was it good science? Was it good history? No. So we know still very little about the Etruscans. I wish, some historians are now saying, well, it's all right to speculate. Well, sure it is, but are you going to write a book and tell me that this is the way things were? And this is what people are now doing with evolutionary psychology. If you notice, they've gone from the idea that our minds are non-adaptive to the idea that this was a very nurturing, caring society. Really? I'm not sure that it was. How do we know? I mean, I think we found evidence that they set people's bones or tried to. Okay, that's a very good thing. You would do that if you were a small group and you needed every member. And we are humans. I mean, we can assume that they had attachments,
There's also evidence that they sucked the marrow from human bones.
Yeah, they were probably not in their kin group.
Not in their group.
Yeah, or, so, anybody want to toss in on that, disagree with me? I'm open to disagree with. I mean, I think it's an open question.
Well, I had some additional questions. A little bit later in your talk, you mentioned natural phrenology.
No, I didn't say natural.
You mentioned natural. I missed the phrase.
Natural theology.
It was in regards to the hype around evolutionary psychology.
Natural theology.
Theology.
Yeah, that was a concept that's kind of strange. In some ways it was good, but it was kind of the idea of look at the workings of nature, and then you can, kind of understand the workings of God. It was better than the fundamentalist, Calvinist doctrine. Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, I believe, were into natural theology.
Okay. And so you're saying that EP maybe is kind of a fallback.
Well, that's what Buller says. I don't know enough about the topic to, stick my neck out on that one. I'm not sure myself, but it's an interesting theory that he put, that he has said in other places, beware of people who just talk about a universal human nature.
Yeah.
That's like that's a religious concept. And I think EP would, the adherents to, the advocates of EP would disagree pretty violently, probably. They probably do with this, idea that they are into this idea of human nature and it's theological. But boy, it is tricky to me.
Yes, it is, and it's a very common phrase in our culture.
Yeah.
Oh, that's just human nature.
Yeah. It's funny because when we were talking with someone whom we agreed with quite a bit, and I won't mention names, but that lady had some interesting ideas, because we were saying something about human nature, and she was saying, well, human nature, it was considered human nature to have slavery at one time. And, you know, and that people would never, you know, not have slavery. Of course, we have slavery all over the world, but it's considered, you know, a heinous crime now. And she was also saying that, you know, it was human nature for women not to, you know, be as intelligent or as active as men. So there are a lot of ideas that are current in our society right now that we say is human nature that isn't at all, it's cultural. That's all. And I'm wondering about EP. What are they saying? I mean, you know.
Well, you can just point to all of the female executives in corporations.
Yeah.
Female heads of their own business.
Yeah.
Etc.
I don't know. I just think that, you know, it's achieved too much currency in the society right now. When we were at the film thing a couple of weeks ago, a film seminar, I presume that lady was a psychiatrist that was speaking, a trained MD, and she was like citing evolutionary psychology. So she wasn't citing anything evidence-based. But you know, and I'm going to get on the bandbox again or ride my hobby horse, that psychologists believe in things that you can't see, and that's part of the problem, I think, psychology. That's like believing in God almost. So they tend to accept things, I think, too readily, and they don't have enough hard evidence sometimes, so they just say, well, this is right. And I was shocked that, you know, a person who should be trained in some scientific theory was up there citing, you know, the ideas of evolutionary psychology and not saying anything about those ideas were in dispute or there wasn't a lot of evidence for them. It's like, actually, you said at one time, Norm, you thought it might spread like a virus. And I didn't think it would, but it has now. It has now. Since the time you said that about 2.5, 3 years ago, it has spread. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. You were prescient.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting.
You mentioned the most important question in biology, but I didn't get a chance to write that down.
Consciousness.
Consciousness, the nature of consciousness or the origin of it?
The origin, the nature, nobody knows very much about it yet. Colin McGinn, again, you know, says that we're probably never going to understand consciousness. And a lot of his opponents make fun of him because he calls it, you know, a mysterium. We may never understand it. And then they always make fun of that expression, the mysterium. But you know, he's very hard-headed. He comes from the working classes in England. So he's got like kind of a practical outlook. And I always enjoy his opinions. So I'm wondering, is he right? We're certainly a long way away. We don't understand anything about consciousness. For all the books that are being written on it. It probably is the most, if we can understand consciousness, we're going to understand a lot of other things. But it's not going to happen anytime soon. Will it ever? We hope so. McGinn might be all wrong, you know.
And you touched on this just real slightly at the end. How do people go about unbelieving, that is, abandoning their beliefs? According to the psychologists of today, how do they reach disbelief? If belief is easier than disbelief, how do you finally get to disbelief?
It's just a subsequent process. Obviously, a lot of those people were using it to saying, you know, I don't believe this statement or whatever was given to them.
But psychologically, I mean, what's going on? What is happening or allowed to happen? Especially when you look at these examples of the pastors who completely lose their faith within a few weeks, you know, where they suddenly wake up and they realize they don't believe anymore. How do you explain that? Wouldn't a much more gradual process of questioning and doubt be a more logical way that someone would lose their belief? But why is it this wholesale, seemingly suddenly wholesale abandonment of all of the religious belief?
Do you think it is? No?
I've heard both. I've heard both some people say, suddenly I realized that I don't believe anymore.
But then I've also heard the other.
And you hear the others,
Yeah.
but it's a complete abandonment, a complete reversal, rather than just, well, now I'm going to be a different denomination of Christianity. It's, now I'm going to leave Christianity, or I'm going to leave Judaism. I've seen that and heard about that a lot. That it's, I don't believe that they're simply making it up. That
Oh no, I don't think
they may finally admit that they never believed, but there's a sudden change in perspective that happens.
Don't you think that it's been going on, maybe unconsciously, somehow? I mean, that they're taking in, you know, like our mind takes in impressions and things. I mean, I reached a certain point of like, I don't think I want to write anymore. I mean, you know, I'm sure that there was a process going on. I didn't really wake up that day and decide that.
So you think even these people are saying that they've suddenly changed, really were changing gradually all along?
Right, and they didn't realize it, or maybe they didn't want to come to terms with it. That must be a wrenching experience. I can't imagine what that must be like. It's very hard. It's very hard to, you know, empathize correctly, I think.
But nevertheless, even if it is gradual, the denouement is not. That is, it's an all or nothing question at that point. Is that they don't say, well, I just won't take the Bible literally anymore. They say, I'm not going to even accept it as metaphorical.
Yeah, which a lot of liberal Christians do.
So the tying of the loose ends is very quick. They cut the ties completely. I don't understand how that happens.
I don't either. I do. Does anybody? I mean, I don't know. Has there been much written about it? I don't think there's been a lot written about that mental process.
Yeah, that would be a good
You know,
topic.
here's the thing that I'll be discussing it in a couple of months when I do atheist sociologies also, that and psychology has tended to work in that direction, that religion is pro-social and religion is adaptive. So there haven't been enough studies of, you know, losing belief, lack of belief, you know, and in fact it's been the idea of not believing in God is denigrated in some sociological circles as being, you know, infantile, you know, rebellious, immature, which is pretty insane.
What about in Europe or in China? Has anyone studied those societies before?
China, I don't know, but in Europe, Foucault, Bourdieu, trying to think. I have them in my paper on atheist sociologies. I can't remember the German. He's really very good. He talks about, you know, rational discourse. There's quite a few who have discussed religion, but kind of peripherally. You know, they're almost like post-atheist, not that much concerned with it, but they have, you know, said certain things about it. But we haven't had good studies. And so we have now atheist scholars who have said this is what should be studied. And I'll be outlining those in atheist sociology, so all the different studies that can be undertaken. We're just at the beginning.
Yes.
That's one of the questions that I had. Have there been any studies in Western cultures measuring the correlation, because you were talking about the correlation between economy up, religion down, or economy down, religion up?
Yeah, Ronald Inglehart, and I think I have the reference in Atheist Sociologies, and Pippa Norris have done a book. In fact, I don't know where he is now, but he was at U of M. And yeah, they have written a book and they've done some studies on this, and there is a strong correlation. But now I don't know what's happening now. You know, you have all these Muslim populations in Europe. That's going to make a big difference, I would think. Although, you know, Jim and I watched a film about a teacher who was in the really, you know, the Muslim area and, you know, the kind of the poor white area of London. And, you know, a lot of those kids did not seem very religious. They were like angry and rebellious because they felt that their culture was pushed aside, their language was pushed aside. But you know, even when their parents were religious, they did not seem to be adopting the religion at all. So that'll be an interesting, I think, trend for the future, which I hope that they leave that religion behind. And I don't know. Secondly, creationism. I have that under evolution. There's I can't remember the guy, Ronald Numbers has written a book. He comes from a religious fundamentalist of some sort. I can't remember what, but he's a well-regarded professor, and he's written a large book, and part of that book that he's recently put out on creationism is that it's rapidly spreading throughout many countries in Europe. And that's scary.
Among what?
Among you know, people in
population.
general, the population in general.
That's scary.
And that is scary. And that's something that we tend to ignore here in the States.
Not the very religious.
Well, I would think it's probably among the very religious, but I think it's also like among a lot of other people. It's a very strange manifestation. He has some figures on it and everything, and that's discouraging. You wonder what's going to happen, you know? And creationism, too, I have a reference under that evolution that it's now spreading among Muslims who did not accept it before.
Well, no, they would have always defended the biblical account
Right,
of creation.
but they weren't into that, you know, like...
They didn't have to be because it wasn't under attack in the general population, you know, until the last 100 years, right?
Okay.
So I think it's a backlash. What you're talking about is a backlash. Creationism is the response to evolution.
Okay, interesting. That's interesting. Okay, because there's some writer. I don't know if he's a children's writer, and he writes books that they give to the children. And it's very, very creationism oriented, and the books are really popular. So this is not a good sign, I think.
I have a correction, and maybe you read this wrong because you were reading fast, but it's positron emission topography. You had
Sorry.
said position.
Oh, you know what? It's probably a typo when I read it that way.
It's a typo, okay.
Okay.
That's positron.
All right. Somebody throw me a thing. Thank you. Boy, you are sharp.
Okay.
I gotta tell you.
Let's see if this one works. This is gonna work.
That has to be corrected in Scholar. Because I'm sure it's in Scholar like that.
Okay.
Okay, sorry, I read it that way. I stand corrected. Oh, and last week, I stand corrected on something I said last week during the discussion, that Emma Goldman was a socialist. She was an anarchist. So I'm on the record.
She would not have called herself
a socialist at all. No, she was an anarchist.
Okay.
So,
The few comments, the rise of psychology or modern psychology, how did that, I would like to discuss or hear more about how that aided and abetted the rise of atheism. The fact that you were going to a psychologist or going to a psychoanalyst, you weren't going to a priest, rabbi for your problems.
I think that was really important. I think that, Freud did a great service to all of us in the contemporary world, even though we've discarded a lot of his ideas. It was an incredible change. That's right, because who did you go to before then?
So, see, it had a side effect that supported secularism.
Oh,
besides
yes.
just his criticism
Oh,
of
yeah.
religion. It's that if we were suddenly going to understand ourselves now through psychology rather than through God,
Right.
then we didn't need God.
Okay, I agree. I guess I didn't bring that out enough, but I can remember the thrill of reading Freud when I was young, and the excitement that he was like criticizing religion, and I had been an atheist, and this was like really wonderful. And then the thrill when slightly older, when I went back to the university, and everybody was doing psychoanalytic criticism at that time, which had a lot of cliche, and the thrill of doing it was all wrong, or at least it was like just one aspect of many aspects of literature. As usual, academe takes like one,
Focus.
idea and focuses on it, for a long time, and then they discard it and go on, which they did, but for a while, when I was in the English department, it was psychoanalytic theory, and it was psychoanalytic theory of film, and it was all very exciting. And it did displace our dependence, I think, on religion. You didn't go to the priest, who didn't know what he was talking about anyway, poor man. And, you know, and unfortunately, you know, we found out that a lot of the psychologists didn't know what they were talking about either. So I don't know. Now, if you notice, again, there's a lot of churches that, you know, their pastors and ministers have taken classes in psychology and psychological counseling, and you notice once again people are going back to that kind of religious counseling, and you know, I think that that's probably not a good thing.
You mentioned the book Moses and Monotheism, and you know, I read that in college, and I even talked about it with my father, and he said that that book was discredited because Freud had several facts wrong that
I'm sure he did. Yeah.
were later you know, discovered by the archaeologists. I don't know if that's true or not, but he isn't the only one that, my father wasn't the only one that criticized that book as being sort of just Freud's imagination, that he was sort of making this story up about Moses in support of his theory.
Yes.
So he modified the Moses story so that it would reinforce his theory, rather than basing it on something that was truly testable or truly factual, because we don't have real evidence for Moses. There has been other historians, these are Jewish historians, who have admitted that Moses probably was not the children of Israel. It wasn't from the Hebrews or B'nai Israel. He was an Egyptian.
Are they fairly sure
so
of that?
That would support, well, his name, everybody points out his name was not a Hebrew name, and that he was not circumcised, or he did not practice circumcision on his son, so that would lend you to believe that he was not of the children of Israel, that he was another
But the Egyptians
culture.
Circumcised.
If you were a highborn, the Egyptians would circumcise.
Oh, the lower classes did not?
So, you know, depending on where the truth lies, there's fabrication, even in the biblical story, there's fabrication. So it's a fiction chasing a fiction. We don't really know what existed, but even if you take the story on face value, the name Moses is not a Hebrew name.
That's fascinating.
And there's also, not all the Jews were in Israel. Were in Egypt. There were many Jews remained in Canaan, even during the famine. They didn't all go, and they weren't all imprisoned. So there's discontinuities, but Freud chose to, you know, pick sides in this and use it to support his theory. I don't think he made a good choice, because it's arguable. Everything about the story itself is arguable. So to use it as an example of this totem figure, you know, Moses as a totem figure, it's kind of an odd pick.
Well, you know, he had a literary turn. You know, what I was just saying about D.H. Lawrence and the Etruscans, you know, that was all basically made up. I mean, we have a few tunes and things, we can extrapolate certain things. But Freud had a literary turn. You know, he was a good writer, and he was very imaginative. And I can see, because people have criticized very much his Leonardo thing, and I think, didn't he write some things on Dostoevsky too? I think, which were I think it was a little more factual, because we have more facts about Dostoevsky. But the Leonardo thing, I think, was like based on some dream that Leonardo had written about. You know,
one dream, and he extrapolated that to a whole psychology or psychoanalysis of Leonardo da Vinci.
And you can't really. How could you psychoanalyze somebody that, you know, isn't there in front of you with a real...
And isn't there to freely associate.
Freely associate or whatever. It disagrees with his theory even, you know. Yeah. But it was interesting, and it was very interesting to read, I think. You know, even though we've discarded the idea now, I think it was, you know, it gave us some kind of awareness that there were other processes going on than what we saw on the surface. But I'm glad you said that about, I thought maybe Freud was probably the only one that had that theory that he wasn't, you know, from Israel. Yeah. I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
I should read up on that, I'm sorry.
And that it was two religions, that the monotheism part of it came from the Egyptian culture, not from the Israel culture.
Ah.
There was multiple gods, and the fusion brought this idea of one God to the fore, which still had its competitors even centuries after Moses. They were still worshiping two gods sometimes. So it's a very strange transition to monotheism, but the Jews claim that they invented monotheism. That's clearly not true.
Yeah, I
The
don't.
Egyptians,
Yeah.
one dynasty already had that.
Aten, the Akhenaten, the pharaoh, and he worshipped the sun god.
Sun god, yes.
And boy, did they wipe that out when he died. That was quick. He moved his whole capital to Thebes, I believe. But I was going to, Friedman, can't remember his first name. I'll be discussing his ideas in biblical criticism. He still remained kind of a theist, but he did a work of kind of like literary detection or biblical detection, and he shows the two groups of Jews that wrote the different parts of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and how that Yahweh was, kind of a transcendental God, and then there was the God that kind of walked on the earth and talked with everybody, and how that fusion created not just this all-powerful God, but like a loving God who was very upset and disturbed by his, creations acting up and doing awful things. And it's a very interesting, idea. So obviously there was a lot of fusion going on. And he thinks that everything was fused in that, well, not everything, but many things were fused under King Josiah, who was undertaking a lot of reforms. And he thinks anyway, Friedman thinks that it was Ezra who was the scribe at the time. And by the way, these books were found when they were remodeling the temple or rebuilding it or something. We just found it. And oddly enough, the books all supported, all the reforms that Josiah was undertaking.
Yes,
it's very
right.
Interesting, but yeah, so I'll be reading that. But this is interesting to me that you were explaining about the Moses thing. I had no idea that it was anybody but Freud. Wow.
Yeah.
So Moses probably was not Jewish.
Right, that's very strongly supported. Now, was he killed? What Freud claimed
Yeah.
is that he was killed, and that's not supported at all. That's just a fabrication.
Well, how about the early tribes killing the father? Continuously. Obviously, all these little kin groups, killed the father, made the totem, and that's just not true. What's his name? Levi. I can't remember his last name.
Strauss.
Levi Strauss. Yeah, he's written a lot of anthropology. Some of that's been he was a structural critic, and a lot of it now has been slightly discredited. I mean, there's other theories, but he came up with interesting things about totems. And some of them, of course, were you lived by the water, so your totem was the fish or whatever. You had some kind of kinship. But he also found that the real purpose, he thought, and I know that there's other interpretations, but his is worth listening to. He thought that the real reason for the totems was to differentiate us, this tribe, from the other tribe. And that makes a lot of sense, too. We've got the bear, they've got the, I don't know what, the opossum or whatever. Because actually, a lot of times, the totem had nothing to do with where they were located or where they had a history of where they came from, or that it was anything that they hunted or anything that was good for the tribe in any way. And I think trying to think what anthropologists said about the same thing, that a symbolic thing is something that would unite the tribe. It could be anything, a flag, a god. So I think sometimes these things don't have, a pipe is just a pipe. I think sometimes a totem is just that, a way to distinguish ourselves from another tribe, a way to create social cohesion.
It's rather interesting that in the Cub Scouts, there's some games that were played and some projects that were made and this group is the possums, this group is the bear, these are the bears.
You got it.
This group is, and all of a sudden you're playing things that were actual facts of thousands of years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. And how quickly we choose up sides,
Oh, yeah.
too, as humans. I find that interesting.
Oh, yes.
One night we were at a dinner party, and afterwards people played one of those wretched after dinner party games, and I think it was charades, but they chose up sides, the men against the women, one of these arbitrary kind of things, and everybody started to really get into it, the competitiveness. And one of the young girls, a kind of rebellious teenager, wouldn't join in. And immediately, the groups were angry at her. It's like, how dare you? I'm going like, boy, this is primitive, like, get me out of here, this is tribal. But it was so quick. All very educated people,
But this might fit in here, I'm not quite sure. In behaviorist terms, are atheists on the right path by attempting to expose the public to alternative ways to a moral life, without examples, without techniques?
Oh, I see. Yeah, we haven't formulated those things quite yet.
We just say, it's a better life. Or you can live morally without God.
Or
But
we say we're happy.
here's how to do it.
Yeah,
Here's the way we do it.
there
Well,
isn't
reason,
enough,
I mean, we advocate rational thinking, reason.
But here's how you
self-
have rational thinking. Here's how you have reason.
I see what Jim's saying. How do you develop it?
How do you teach to
Yeah.
think? How do you teach to think?
Yeah, a lot of those people haven't been taught to think. I mean, that's why they're religious. I mean, the fundamentalists, some of them.
So it's even more basic than just saying you should use reason.
I think that's a good point. I really do, because, how do you get there? I mean, we keep, like, in a sense, pounding it into them. Well, use reason. Well, how do I use reason, Or all those tenets of rational thinking. I mean, what does that mean to those people? Not very much, I don't think. We're forcing rationality against this feeling. You notice this Pentecostal, this evangelistic Pentecostal group.
Mm-hmm.
They're not interested in rationality or reason or logical thinking or critical thinking. They have this. That's why one of the reviewers that I read about this reviewer thought, because of the fact that they feel that God has spoken to them, and He's told them that His story is real. I mean, we laugh, but they believe it. That this is why the new atheists, ideas, which we find so stirring and compelling, have fallen flat on these people. Mm-hmm. And it is true, it's fallen flat.
We have another problem with this too.
It's very vexing.
If some people are hearing the voice of God in their everyday lives, what responsibilities can they be trusted with in a high-tech society?
Well, they've achieved responsible positions for good
Yes,
or
they
ill.
have.
And they
Look at,
compartmentalize.
I'm sure that, I understood better when I was looking over the idea of this book that George Bush, our last president before Obama, and we were all laughing at him that he talked to God, but that's not anything so unusual.
A lot of people understood that.
Well, yeah, you know what? I think the evangelistic groups understood that. Joan Didion actually wrote something in the New York Review of Books, and she said that he was using code words and expressions that the religious understood. And she charted those out, and I was going, no kidding. Oh, that, when he's saying, they're understanding that what he's saying, And I think when he was saying that God, and the rest of us were saying, this man must be insane, or there's something funny, and gee, that makes me nervous and gives me the creeps. They understood what he was saying because they were in the same place, and they all know that they're not really crazy, they're just whatever. I have no idea what they are. I don't think I want to be around them. But how do you argue with these people?
Well, you know what they say about the New York Review of Books.
Yeah, I know, it's a left-wing blah, blah. But that was a good article. She's the only person that I know, it might have been in other scholarly journals, but she's the only person I know that wrote for kind of the general educated public anyway, even though left wing, that actually, gave us the expressions and explained, what they meant as to evangelicals and the religious fundamentalists. I didn't know. I mean, I thought some of the things he was saying were like really insane. I mean, I was wondering if he was like, all there, and he seemed to be functioning. I said, well, he was an alcoholic, maybe something went wrong or whatever. No, I mean, he was just speaking in the jargon of the religious fundamentalist, and they understood him perfectly.
And this goes right along with that. I'm going to sit back and keep my peace. To nudge the culture toward the secular, can the module of religion be isolated and addressed in such a way to modify, not eliminate, or at best redirect to less magic and more reason?
Well, you see how small those religions are, and they're actually losing ground. Unitarians, Episcopalians, the more reasonable religions aren't really doing that well.
Where did you get that figure of 2 to 3 religions a day?
That was from Gazzaniga, who I assume his figures were correct. I'm sure he had, references of some sort.
Okay, because that may be a definitional on how you define a religion. I mean, he may be talking about new churches or new schools of thought.
He said religion.
But to say that there's a new religion.
I had read somewhere else that I don't know if there's that many, but
But these are just extensions of existing religions. These are just modifications.
Well, yeah, but it's like in America, I mean, the Baptists continuously split. I mean, and they 7 or 8 of them start meeting in somebody's house, and then if they're able to attract a new group.
But to you and I, it's the same religion.
Yeah, it is to us,
Yeah.
but it isn't to them. I mean, I don't think it's the same. I think now they feel that they're the true Baptists.
Yeah.
But there's a lot, I had read that there's a lot of other, people come up with new religions all the time. That's what I had read before, not just in Gazzaniga. I wasn't given figures. But I've read that I decide one day that, I don't know, God talked to me, or I read the Bible properly, or I read something else, and well, look at, what's his name? What's that religion that's so hot now, and was hot in Hollywood? Tom Cruise's religion.
Oh, yeah.
Scientology.
Yeah,
Ron Edward just came up with that idea, though.
Yeah, in 1948.
A lot of people do. Most of those just fall by the wayside. They get like 2 or 3 people,
and then it's gone.
And then no, it doesn't have any kind of resonance with enough people, and it's gone.
Yeah,
it's gone in a few months or a year.
That didn't have a lineage. That was a truly new religion.
Yeah, I think you'll find that there's other people that come up with ideas similar to that, and they don't have this resonance, and it's gone. And then there's all the schisms. And that's so weird, But people, like interpret the Bible differently, or or God talks to them, or some angel, I mean, look at the Mormon thing. That's different. I think he was
100 years ago.
What was his name that started? I think he was a con man, I believe.
Joseph Smith. Yeah, he was uneducated.
1850s.
Interesting. That's somebody who lies and convinces people of the truth of his lies. And then all of a sudden, we went to the best con of all.
A private equity.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure, I don't know. I don't understand religion in the last analysis. I think that's one thing that Steven Pinker said that was almost profound, that he couldn't come up with one single
That was very humble.
And I thought that was very truthful and very honest. Yeah. And is there one single theory, or is it a lot of things? And that's scary. And will we ever get rid of it? Will we ever, will people ever drop the need for it? It's growing.
I wouldn't say it's growing. I would say
not religion. I mean the unchurched.
The
The unchurched.
Yeah, the unchurched.
unchurched.
So that's a positive.
Yeah, it is a positive.
Okay. Anything else? You ready for our next lecture?
Well, no, I have one. Oh, you're not. You're finished.
You like,
What? I can't believe it. He doesn't have any more questions.
God damn, it's 9:30.
I can't help that. I can't help that. Atheism may find its path by interacting with more liberal religions in shared activities, from food for the poor and community service projects. State and church separation. Would this behavior interface with contemporary psychology theories?
Oh, wow. Why don't you answer that one?
How do I know?
That's too hard.
Well, let's
How
think.
am I
I'm going to
supposed
think
to-
about that. Maybe that's a project I can take up and try to.
That would be great.
It's hard for if you're. Then the next sentence says, street corner or bread basket.
But this is the accommodationist. This is the accommodationist.
Well, maybe sometimes you're not going to move them. You're not going to move people toward reason by screaming at them.
But if you work with them, they're only going to say, well, these atheists, aren't bad people after all. They're kind of nice people, but you're not going to change their mind about their religion. Any
The
more than
liberal,
they're going to change
watch out
our
now.
mind about
The liberal.
even the liberal.
liberal.
You're not going to change their mind. They're going to be in a certain mind category. Some of the Unitarians that I lectured to at Farmington were very accepting of our
However,
ideas. Others were a little, more skeptical that came to the lectures, which was okay. They're nice people and they're smart, and we took our son there to learn comparative religion and things at one time. But you can't move people by just working together with them. On Amnesty International, and they're wonderful people, many of them are religious. And at one time, I worked with the Detroit branch, especially, my sector.
Guess where they met?
And they met, they met in a room with a crucifix, and there was usually a priest who was very good about, being against the death penalty, a really good social activist, and there was a nun. And, a lot of these people are very good people. Did they change my mind about my religion? No. Did I change their mind about, being an atheist and unchurched? No. There was a Unitarian that's very active and still active there. Did he change their mind? No. Did they change his mind? No. So we were all working together for a common cause.
But hung on to the basic.
But we all hung on to our basic belief system. I don't know that anybody ever changed because of what they were doing working together. So is it going to happen?
Well, maybe the best thing that we hope for in a situation like that is the commonality that we find with Barry Lynn and his group, the Americans United for the Separation of Church and State,
Where
and
there's
keep
all-
working the Constitution, keep working.
That's
that to keep-
really important. I don't know how you feel about that, Norm, but I think you're into that heavily, aren't you? The legal aspects.
If you change the culture, though, it doesn't matter. You're just not, the lawmakers aren't going to write laws that people don't really want. So if they don't want to hear about creationism in the public schools, if they laugh at that idea, then they're not going to try to put creationism in the public schools. So no, I think that, I guess if I was a lawyer, I would feel differently, but if I'm not a lawyer, I'm not going to put money into trying to fight in the courts.
Really?
That's an old paradigm. That's the 1960s. That's what Madeline Murray O'Hare made her name up. You're stuck, though, in the old paradigm. If you change the culture, you don't need to go to court, because the culture has changed from beneath you. And I'll have more to say about that after our meetup. That the attitudes of the populace ultimately undermine everything. Every law that's on the book can be undermined by the general majority populace.
Which is what we're trying to do with circumcision.
Yeah,
is to change
circumcision,
people's
drugs,
minds.
and sex. They're all gay marriage. All of those previous thinkings and seemingly monolithic ideas are going to be completely swept away, because the population is gonna change.
So it
won't matter.
comes from below almost.
Yeah,
to
I
the
really,
high.
I'm a
That's
very strong
interesting.
Well, that's
believer in
very
the populist
interesting.
front, yeah.
Well, the gay marriage thing.
Well,
I
the
mean,
the whole gay situation did not come from the top down.
No,
Right.
it came
No.
from
That's
the
an excellent
bottom up.
example. It
Never.
came from the
Circumcision
bottom
is
up.
beginning to come, you know.
Yes.
I noticed so much, you know, that at at one of the conferences that we attended, you know, how many of the nurses were saying, well, oh no, we don't pressure anybody. Oh no, the doctors don't, not in our system. You know, and then they would name their system, you know, well, we all know that doctors pressure. You know, that they're going to give the parents the facts, so-called, but they're going to emphasize the facts that agree with them, and a lot of them are for circumcision. So this movement is coming from the parents educating themselves, being aware of things we've put up on the internet by interfacing with them and things like that. So, yeah, I'll agree with you on a lot of things.
Yeah.
Sex, too, like in Brazil, you know, they embrace the Pope. When he comes, they really make a big fuss, and they all turn out. And the Pope tells them, you've got to change your, you know, sexual leniency and permissiveness, and you can't do this. And they all go, oh yes,
Yeah,
Pope,
yes,
you know, this is wonderful. We're going to change tomorrow.
He gets on the
leaves,
plane.
and everybody goes back to their,
Right.
They're
because
right back to Mardi
it's their
Gras.
sexual culture.
Yeah, and in the Islamic world, I believe that's what also happens, is there's a great hypocrisy about what people say they do and what they actually do.
Oh yeah.
There's a tremendous difference. And I'm also thinking about marijuana, because in 20 years, I believe that marijuana is going to be legal in the state of Michigan. There's just such a popular undercurrent in that direction.
I think maybe
They're
you're
not
right.
going to keep it.
I think maybe you're right.
Yeah, it's just, nobody's going to take it
Wasn't
seriously.
there an article just in the New York Times op-ed page?
Well, that was really sad. There's
Very
a
sad.
judge. He's still a sitting judge.
He's a sitting federal
Was it
judge.
in New York or New Jersey? One of the boroughs there. And he has a very bad, he's like third or fourth stage pancreatic cancer, I believe. It was a pancreatic, it was one of those
Yeah.
like really cancers that they can't do much. But he's outlived the predictions. And he's still sitting on cases, but he has had all kinds of procedures and surgeries, and he's nauseous, and he's got symptoms, you know, and lo and behold, some friend, you know, offered him some marijuana, and he took it, and it's helping him. So he is now, you know, illegally.
He's able to eat.
And he's able
Without
to
getting
eat.
sick.
He's not, because he
This
was
is
losing weight. He was
in the
getting
New York
debilitated.
Times?
Yeah, it was in the
Yeah.
New York Times editorial. And he said a lot of friends had advised him not to come out of the closet on the issue because he's a sitting judge.
Wow.
But he said he doesn't care because he wants to give some, hope and some kind of fortitude to the people that have to hide.
Yeah, the example's right there with no circ.
Yeah.
Why can't we do that with atheism? Why can't we concentrate on
People get
getting that
scared.
message?
You know, they get more scared, like, now, by hearing you don't believe in God, than by being against circumcision and by, being for gay marriage. They're more afraid when you say you don't believe in God.
Among what people?
Just the normal
The
bourgeois people.
normal surveys. Normal.
Well,
Pew,
the survey,
Pew.
the
No,
scientists
I mean,
are-
no, when you talk to
in
people.
our circles. That's
People
in
get,
our
well, in our
circles.
circle, the more educated circles, no,
You don't
people
run
don't
into
care.
that.
But your average circle, even when they're educated, some of a lot of the seniors are not uneducated people that walk there.
Okay.
I'm sure if you told those people that you were an atheist, that they would
Oh,
like,
they'd
a
be
lot of them would
furious.
just have a fit.
Is that
They would
right?
be
Oh,
upset,
they'd be
very
furious.
upset. Well, I mean, they wouldn't hurt you. or
They wouldn't be
anything.
your friend anymore?
Well, we're not really friends with
we're
them
not friends with
anyway.
them
We
anyway.
keep to
Well,
ourselves.
what would
but-
they do when you say they were going to be upset? What would they?
Well, I mean, I think that they would, probably talk among themselves and say,
Glare at
they
you.
don't believe in God, and things, because they're frightened. They're getting close to the end of their lives.
They're
I mean, I hear conversations all the time.
looking for the great
"Well,
white flash."
It's better, it's better, to, just kind of keep your mouth shut and go to church. I hear passing conversations like that.
Yeah.
They're afraid,
And if you were going to do a sequel to this topic, which I hope you do, I think that you should do it on how did psychology then in turn drive the move towards atheism, not just how the psychologist, had an atheist perspective, but how in turn as they shared their psychology, how did that drive this?
So I didn't bring that out enough.
You touched on it, but in one of my comments or questions, I did want to hear
remember
more
you
about
said,
that.
yeah.
how did this catalytic process happen? They call it autocatalytic, where each new step in progress in turn accelerates the progress even more. So that
I understand.
we progress in our understanding of the human mind, that in turn accelerates this understanding that there's no God.
You know, I think why I didn't approach it more was that there hasn't been enough study. That everything, you'll see when I do sociology, that all the studies have been pushed to the fact that religion is pro-social, that anti-religion is not good, or else just ignored. I think probably some of it is funds, you know, for certain studies and what have you. I think now, you know, as we get the unchurched and it's becoming a topic for consideration, maybe there will be some studies. There's been a few, but not enough. And I think that, I don't think that they've approached this.
Well, I think you're going to have to do some original.
Well, that's what I thought I was trying.
Exploration.
I thought I was trying
Wow.
to. That's what I thought I was trying to say. You know, because David Wolf, I think, approaches it the most in his, you know, in his book on the psychology of religion. He's practically the only one that I found, other than a book here and a book there. It's quite incredible when you get done. Not only is our history has to be teased out, but the psychology of what's been going on in psychology and sociology and related things, we have been really pushed to the outer limits, the outer edges. It's quite fascinating to me. You know, I didn't realize it till I began this more serious, concentrated study.
You might want to tie in also how science feeds into this, the new discoveries.
Yeah.
In science, cosmology.
Neuroscience.
There's not been enough study about atheists. It just begins, you know, their attitudes, how they arrived at it.
So Harris hasn't published anything new in his neuroscience research?
I don't think so. You don't quote me because I'm not sure, but the latest book, which, if you remember, I criticized on Amazon in the reviews, was, I think, very poorly done. I don't know why he even wrote it on free will. I mean, there's been, if you're against the idea of free will, which he definitely is, there's so many better theorists of that, you know, that I just can't imagine what he thought he was doing.
Yeah.
I think that, you know, when is he going to mature? This is all at first I was saying, well, he's young, but he's not that young anymore.
Yeah.
And, you know, he's been in neuroscience now for a while. I mean, those experiments didn't really come to very much, if you notice that he did. I mean, they were kind of interesting, but they kind of were like, they were things that we probably could have assumed anyway. But this thing on free will was so poorly done. I mean, you know, when, you know, that class that Great Courses has on, like, the adherents of the advocates of free will and the advocates of compatibility and the advocates of, you know, determinism, it's those theorists are so well known in the field and so much better than Harris that I don't know why he attempted it. He doesn't even discuss a lot of them even.
He thought his name was...
He's got to know, yeah, I'm sure it's his name,
He's
and then, you know, people, you know, love him in the, you know, non-religious community, and they just read everything that, you know, he writes, and they say, oh, well, see, Harris is against free will. And, you know, I'm a compatibilist, so I'm not really against the idea that there may not be free will. I mean, you know, I'm still, you know, waiting for more evidence, but... You know, if you're going to say there isn't, you have to, like, have some convincing arguments, and I don't think he did. He was preaching to the choir. Try that course sometime in Great Courses, and you'll see the difference between those theorists and what he was doing. I mean, just read Dennett, as a matter of fact.
I know, I just think that it's, there's this interplay happening between psychology and religion, but not all of the things coming out of psychology are particularly helpful because, you know, this idea of sin has then now transformed to this idea of
Unhealthy.
mental illness.
Unhealthy, too.
Unhealthy.
How many times do you hear that? This is unhealthy behavior.
Or not normal,
Yeah. All of a sudden you're like, I'm sorry.
You know, the alcoholic used to need God, you know, now he needs this medicine, he needs this diagnosis.
Yeah.
Now he's bipolar, he's depressed. So that the priesthood has changed from the clerical, theological
yes.
priesthood to the
Thank you.
medical priesthood. That's the pathological side of these new developments in psychology, is that the medicine and psychiatry have taken the place, in a bad way, of religion.
I agree.
In a very negative way. And Freud was a part of that, and you mentioned that in your talk.
Yeah.
But the modern psychologists and the DSM are part of that too, is that,
Yeah.
oh, you're not a sinner, you're not a bad person, you're an unhealthy person.
I hate
You're
that
sick.
word. I'm so tired of them hearing,
Yeah.
you know, when you read any articles by them or anything like that, this is unhealthy, that's unhealthy. Well, it's just bourgeois values that they're reinforcing.
Right.
I mean, I don't want to hear your bourgeois crap.
Well, but it's thinly veiled, they're influenced by religion even if they don't know it. This idea of evil, the child is evil, the child needs to
Aren't we hearing that a lot today?
molded.
But they're not saying the child is evil.
So
Now they're saying
he's
you know,
sick.
the child is maladapted.
Yeah.
Maladaptive,
Yeah,
his brain chemistry is
Yeah,
wrong.
unhealthy behavior, and we'll
Yeah.
take care of it, but we're not going to condemn him for being like evil or a sinner.
Right, so again, they're freed of taking responsibility themselves
Yeah.
in any meaningful way. And then it
Well, I
becomes-
want to thank everybody very much for all their contributions tonight. And
I think the camera
I
is shutting
think the
down.
camera's going, whoop.